Hey friends, how's it going? My name is Gabby, welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to be doing an exciting book recommendation video where I'm going to be recommending horror books that I think are good for beginners. And this video is something I've been requested to make for a couple years now. It's something I've been wanting to make for a couple of years now. I actually made a video kind of similar to this with some thriller recommendations for beginners, so if you missed that video, I'll have that one linked down below. But I wanted to make this video for people who are looking to get into horror but they don't really know where to start. I personally only recently started actively reading horror books in the year 2020, so I've only been reading horror now for about 3 years, and I do think horror is one of those genres where you're kind of like overwhelmed by all of the things because you don't really know what to expect. Now I've been reading this genre pretty actively for the last 3 years, and in those 3 years I've read almost 200 horror books. So today I'm going to be recommending you 10 horror books that I think would be perfect to start if you're just looking to dabble into horror and you're not really sure where to start. This is the video for you. But before we do jump into the recommendations, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to a new sponsor on this channel, which is Lingoda. So Lingoda is a language learning service, and I think something that makes Lingoda unique compared to other language learning services is that their focus is on face-to-face learning, and they use the language sprint concept for their classes. Something that I think is really awesome about Lingoda is the fact that they have such flexibility with their classes. They offer classes 24/7, so you can choose to take classes whenever works best in your schedule, and the classes are about 60 minutes long and they're always held on Zoom. These classes offer a really immersive learning experience because you're usually only in a class with like 3 to 5 other students and you have a native speaker who's helping you learn, and so you really get that like individual feedback, which is also really helpful. They're currently offering classes in a number of different languages, including English, Business English, Spanish, German, and French, and they have beginner classes that you can take if you've never spoken a word of that language in your life, but they have all the way up to advanced level classes, so no matter where you're at in your language learning journey, there is a class for you. And Lingoda does also have this sprint challenge. Their sprint challenge is basically a 30-day intensive course where you're going to be learning a lot in a short amount of time, and through the power of consistency and really focusing on speaking in class, it'll help to boost your confidence. So they do one sprint challenge that's 15 lessons in 30 days, and then they have the super sprint, which is 30 lessons in 30 days. And the good thing for you is that by completing the different sprint challenges that they have, you can earn rewards. After the completion of the sprints, you can either choose 50% cash back or receive Lingoda class credits, which is about worth 100% of your cash back. I come from a Mexican family, so learning Spanish has always been something that I've wanted to do because a lot of my family members speak Spanish, and even after taking Spanish in high school, I still don't feel like I know too much. But with Lingoda, it has been super helpful and super easy so far. I really like the intimate class settings, and I also think the teachers are so friendly and have so much knowledge and make it so much easier for me to learn. So don't miss out on this one-time offer to boost your language learning with Lingoda's 30-day sprint challenge. You can click the link down below for more information, or you can use my code gabbyreads to get 20 euros or $25 off of your sprint registration, which is so cool and so exciting. So thank you so much to Lingoda for sponsoring today's video, and now let's get into the books. Alright, so my first recommendation for horror beginners, this one might be an obvious one because it's gonna be Pet Sematary by Stephen King. Because of course, if you're wanting to read horror books, you might be curious about the king of horror, Stephen King. I feel like it's really hard to read the horror genre without reading Stephen King, and the reason why I recommend Pet Sematary is because this is my personal favorite book by Stephen King, but another reason why I think it's really great for beginners is because it's not too long. You might have heard that Stephen King is the king of horror books, but he also is known for writing very long and lengthy horror books, like for example the book It, which is 1100 pages. And so I think if you're looking to get into horror books but you're intimidated by the size of a lot of Stephen King books, then I think Pet Sematary would be the perfect one to start with, because this book is a little bit lengthy. I mean, it's almost about 400 pages, but it is nowhere near close to a lot of his other horror books. And I also think this one just has one of the most unique and interesting concepts. It's one of the Stephen King books that has really just captured my attention the most right away, and it's a book that I just absolutely fell in love with when I first read it. I actually do have a reading vlog of my experience reading this book for the first time, so I can have that link down below if you want to check it out. But I just think Pet Sematary is such a freaking classic, and it's so good, and I just think it's one of those books that could really get you into horror books. I think it is one of those books that'll just grab you, and once you read this book, you won't be able to stop thinking about it. My next recommendation is also going to be another Stephen King, but this is the only other Stephen King book on this list, but it's Night Shift by Stephen King. And the reason I think this one would be a good one to start with is because this is actually a collection of short stories from Stephen King. Short stories would be a really good thing to start with in horror because it'll introduce you to a bunch of different different, you know, horrific kind of things that you might not think about. I think short horror stories are always really awesome because you're usually gonna find something that you like in a collection, you know? You might not like every single story, but that's why I think they're so much fun to read because you're guaranteed gonna like a few things out of it. You might be familiar with that movie, The Boogeyman, that just recently came out, and that was originally a short story in this collection. That was definitely one of my favorite short stories in this collection, actually, so I'm really excited about the fact that they just recently made it into a movie. But no, I haven't seen it yet, if you're wondering. But this short story collection, if I'm correct, I do think this was Stephen King's first ever published short story collection, and it still remains my favorite collection from him. I think this collection is so strong. There are so many spooky little creepy stories in here, and I just think short stories are so much fun for horror because I don't think with this genre, I don't think you need a really long book to get really scary. You know, like it doesn't take much to scare someone as long as it's written in a really interesting way, and so I would highly recommend checking this one out. The next book that I'm gonna recommend is gonna be Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. Now listen, I know that some people might say that this isn't really even a horror book, that this is more of like a mystery thriller, and you might be right, like I wouldn't disagree with you, but I do think this would be the perfect thing to read if you're looking to get into horror, mostly because of the vibes. Because, you know, in this book, yes, it's a mystery thriller, there is a mystery and it is very thrilling, but there's also a haunted house at the center of this book. And this book reminded me a lot of like The Haunting of Hill House, you know, it definitely has those vibes. And so I do think if you're looking to get into horror and you don't know where to start, maybe this one would be a good place to start, especially if you are used to reading more like mystery thrillers, but you're wanting to start dabbling into horror a little bit more. I do think this would be a great one to start with because it's creepy. There are some scenes in this book that truly freaked me out and I was like, what the heck am I reading right now? I would also recommend this one for beginners because I do think that the writing is just really interesting and really grabs you. You know, it's very interesting because we not only get the present day chapters of this woman Maggie who's going back to this house that she grew up in that, you know, they think it's haunted, but in alternate chapters we do get chapters from her dad's memoir that he wrote that's called House of Horrors. And so we kind of get to learn more about the house through the father's chapters, and the way that we go back and forth just makes for such an engaging reading experience that I think this would be an interesting one that will hold your attention. The next one that I'm going to recommend is going to be Bird Box by Josh Mallerman. This is another one that might seem kind of obvious, but I just had to. This is a book that I probably read back in like 2018, and this was before I was really actively reading horror, but I just fell in love with this book. Like I was so obsessed with it. And this book, it does have a movie on Netflix if you're wondering. It's the one with Sandra Bullock, and I thought the movie was pretty good too. I mean, I don't know, I think the book is better, but I still had a good time with the movie. But I think this is a really fun one, especially if you're used to reading kind of like, I don't know, apocalyptic kind of fiction, because, you know, this one definitely has that. It takes place in this world where there are these monsters, question mark, like we don't really know what's going on in the world. All that we know is that we're following people who, you know, they have to wear blindfolds every time they go out into the world, because when you see it, it's over for you. Like something just happens to you where you just go insane and you either try to like kill yourself or kill other people, like you just go nuts. Reading this book almost feels like you're blindfolded as the protagonist because you don't know what they're afraid of. And I think fear of the unknown can be one of the creepiest things for me. And I also think it's just so action-packed. It's so interesting because it's this kind of, you know, post-apocalyptic world, but we do see at the beginning of this book, if I'm remembering correctly, because it has been a couple years since I've read this, but I think we do see the early stages of like this apocalypse kind of starting and like the chaos and the intensity of like all of that happening. But then we also do, you know, follow this character throughout time and kind of see how she learns to deal with it. All right, this next one that I'm going to recommend is going to be controversial because it's going to be either a hit or a miss for people, but that's going to be The Troop by Nick Cutter. And yes, this book is a little graphic. It's a little intense. There's a lot of body horror in this book. And so you might be wondering, why the heck would I recommend this for beginners? Because I feel like this book is going to be a lot for most people. And it is, but the reason why I want to recommend this for horror beginners is because I personally read this book at the beginning of like my lifetime of reading horror. You know, I read this book in early 2020, and I really do credit this book to like getting me obsessed with horror books. And so if it wasn't for this book, I don't know if I would be as obsessed with horror books as I am today. And so maybe there are some people out there, I know a lot of of people don't really like this book, or they think I'm crazy for recommending it, but maybe there are some of you out there who would also read The Troop and then fall into love with horror and get obsessed with horror books, because this is a really disgusting and like graphic and like gross horror book where we're following a bunch of these like Boy Scouts essentially, and they're going to this little island, they're camping in the Canadian wilderness, and then there's this man that like rolls up on the island and he's like shoveling dirt into his mouth and he's like, oh, I'm so hungry, and it's like creepy, right? Like, and they're kind of like, what the fuck is going on? And then what ends up happening is this most disturbing, disgusting body horror, kind of thinking like worms coming out of your mouth kind of body horror, okay? It's disgusting, it's gross, but honestly, I don't know, there was something about this book, I don't know how to explain it, but after reading this, I was just like, holy shit, I'm obsessed, and I got obsessed with horror. I mean, I pretty much named my book club after this book because now I have a book club called the Booktube, and I've actually read this book twice, and I know that some people think I'm absolutely insane for recommending this book because they think it's so gross and just disgusting and like a waste of time, but maybe there are some of you out there who would read this and just love it, so I have to recommend it. The next book that I'm gonna recommend is going to be My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix, and this one is kind of like one of those essential young teen 80s summer vibe kind of stories. And you know, Grady Hendrix, he's the author of this book. I think his books in general would be a really great introduction into horror books, because I personally read his book The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. That was one of the first horror books that I ever read too, and that was another one that I really fell in love with, but I think particularly this one would be a fun time. I think especially, you know, if you are a fan of like 80s horror movies and you're just looking to get a similar vibe from books, then I think this one would be a great time, because I think Grady Hendrix has such a unique approach to his horror writing. I really do think he's quite a bit different from any of the horror authors that I typically read, because he has such a like satirical kind of like silly approach to writing some of his horror books, and sometimes it works for me and sometimes it doesn't. But with this book, I just think it was such a unique time, it was such a fun time, it felt so nostalgic of like 80s horror movies. And if you're wondering, no, I don't usually like reading about exorcisms, because like the main thing in this book is like my best friend's exorcism, you know, like the best friend gets fucking possessed, and then it's about these two young girls who are trying to like deal with this situation, and I don't usually like reading about exorcisms or like possessions. Like, I don't usually give a fuck, if I'm being honest. I don't usually care, but there was something about the way that this book was written, it was just so interesting, it was so engaging, and Grady Hendrix is known also to write some really like brutal scenes that are just like, you know, like it'll give you all of those horror things that you might be looking for. The next one that I'm gonna recommend is gonna be When the Reckoning Comes by LaTanya McQueen, and this is one that I would recommend if you want a horror book where you genuinely care about the characters, because at least that was the case for me. This is a book where we're following this protagonist who, she's going back to this small town that she grew up in because her best friend is gonna be getting married, but her best friend is this white girl who's gonna be getting married on this plantation that's been like completely renovated into like a resort, and it's really creepy and unsettling because at this resort where she's gonna be getting married, all of the staff and like all of the people who are working there are black, and it seems like some of the slaves that were tortured on this property seem to haunt this plantation. I think this is a great horror book to read if you're looking for something that has a bigger message behind it, you know, about us as a society, or us as in like the world, and how we can do better and how we should be doing better and what happens when shit like this happens. But this is also just one where I found myself really caring about the characters. There's even a little bit of a romance, you know, because this girl is going back to her town where she grew up, and there was this guy there that she used to, you know, be connected with in a way, and they're reconnecting. So there was even a bit of a romance in this book happening that I also kind of cared about. So I think if you're the kind of person that like needs to care about the characters that you're reading about in order to enjoy the experience, I think this would be a great one to start with. And also if you're coming from the romance genre, like if you're a romance girly, you might find this one more enjoyable as well. All right, the next one that I'm gonna recommend is gonna be Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. This one I think has one of the most unique and fun premises for a horror book that I've ever read, and I think why this one would also be pretty cool for like people that are just starting to get into horror to read this book is because this book is so meta and so self-aware, because we're following 4 different horror authors in this book, and it's interesting because they all kind of talk about their experiences with writing horror books and just like experiences about writing in general. But it's interesting because those 4 horror authors, they're gonna be having to stay the night in Kill Creek, which is America's most haunted house, on the night of Halloween, and it's gonna get live streamed to everyone in the world. Like, does that not sound like the coolest premise you've ever heard? I just think this book is really cool, and it is really meta because, you know, all 4 of these writers are writers of the horror genre. And even though this book is like a little over 400 pages, I was able to fly through this book so quickly because I thought the writing was so interesting, and I just thought it was so well done and so engaging. And once I finished it, like that last little bit of this book, I was like, bitch, what? It's like, it's one of those books that you just want to like scream about it because I was so excited. And to this day, it remains one of my favorite haunted house horror books. So if you're looking for something like this, I would highly recommend. This one is so much fun. The next one that I'm gonna recommend is gonna be The Winter People by Jennifer McMahon. Specifically recommend this to people who are either fans of Pet Sematary by Stephen King. Like if you're watching this video and you're like, oh, I've already read Pet Sematary, then I would definitely recommend you read this one next, because this one has a very similar vibe to Pet Sematary, but it's kind of like different, but the plot is like very similar. But I almost think this one might even be better than Pet Sematary. Like, I don't know. I don't know which one I prefer personally because I just love them both so much. But this is also one that I would recommend to fans of, you know, historical fiction, because this one actually has a timeline that takes place in 1908. So there is some chapters in this book that have that like historical fiction feel to them, which I know usually for me personally, that the sound of that would just like bore me to tears and I'd be like, oh, skip next. But trust me, even if you're not a historical fiction person, that's not the majority of the story, because the chapters go back and forth between, you know, 1908 and like present day. So we do get a little bit of a mix. But I also think if you do typically enjoy historical fiction, then this might even be even more up your alley. But this one is so interesting, you know, because we're just following this small town where people are going missing and they can't seem to figure out why. And both the flashback chapters of like 1908 and then the present day chapters, they're connected in a really interesting way because they're taking place in the same small town, but they're just like almost like 100 years apart, you know? So it's just really interesting. I also think this one would be perfect to read, you know, in the more colder months of the year because, you know, The Winter People, if you couldn't tell from this cover, there's a very like snowy winter atmosphere to this book that is just everything. It's everything. It is so atmospheric and it's so good. So I would definitely recommend checking this one out, especially in the winter time, but like any time of year would be good, but especially in the winter, you know? All right, and then the 10th and final book that I'm going to be recommending for beginners is going to be Pen Pal. And this book is so unique and it's so weird. This book is basically divided into 6 different chapters, and every chapter is dedicated to a different memory from this character's childhood. And he's kind of, you know, looking back on his childhood and recalling these different memories that now, looking back on it as an adult, it just seems like something was going on and like there was more creepiness and more things happening than he originally thought. And dude, this shit was so creepy. I don't even know how to explain what in this book creeped me out so much, but it was like this was written just for me or something. Like this was exactly the kind of shit that scares me, and I don't even know how to describe to you why I think it's so scary. It's just so subtly creepy the way that this book was written. And the main thing about this book is that it's called Pen Pal because there was a situation when they were in elementary school when they like wrote these little notes and they put them into balloons and they like let them go, and they, you know, it was like trying to find a pen pal, right? So like these elementary school kids wrote these notes that were like, write me back to my school, like this is my name and like this is my information, and they just sent out their little balloons. And then part of it is about how like there's somebody out there who got one of these notes and there's creepy things that start happening after that, and it's like they feel like they're being watched. It's like some kind of stalker situation, but it's also so much more than that, you know, because that's only a small part of this story, because it almost feels like it's like 6 different short stories in a way because the chapters and the way that they're broken up. But gosh, there have just been so many scenes that have really stuck with me over like the year it's been since I've read this book. Like I just think about this book all the time and I'm always just like, ooh, it's just so creepy and so bizarre and so weird. I don't think this is gonna work for everyone necessarily, but I do think this would be a fun one to try for beginners because it's definitely become one of my all-time favorites. All right, so those are all of the different horror recommendations that I have for beginners. I would love to know if you're planning to read any of these books as a horror beginner, if any of these do sound interesting to you and you're gonna give them a shot. I would love to know that. I would also love to know if you are a more, you know, avid reader of horror and you are watching this video. I would love to know in the comments what you would personally recommend for beginners. And if you are an avid horror reader and you've read some of these and you're looking for more recommendations, I will have linked down below. I've done so many different kinds of horror book recommendation videos before, and so if you're looking for some more books to read, I will have those videos linked so you can check those out as well. And thank you so much for watching and for hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate you, and I'll see you very soon with another video. Bye!